Hello everyone, welcome to another video. Today I want to show you how we can use Azure Policy to enforce rules on all our AKS clusters to make sure that our cluster follow our company guidelines and security recommendations. First, I want to give you an introduction of what Azure Policy is, and then I'm going to show you how we can use the AKS Azure Policy add-on to have Azure policies inside our cluster. This means we can apply them to Kubernetes resources. And then I'm going to show you how we can use Azure policies to manage the features and configuration of the cluster itself. So first, let's get started with what Azure Policies is. With Azure Policies, we can define rules, and then we can apply these rules to our resources. The great thing about Azure Policies is that these rules are applied automatically. And this also means that they are enforced automatically and therefore keep the developers or prevent the developers from deploying resources that are not compliant with my guidelines. All of this ensures that over time I have a compliant and secure environment in my entire tenant. And as a result, I can also have a unification of my solutions. This means if I have many different teams or even companies that develop my solutions, I can apply these Azure policies on my tenant, and then all the teams have to follow these policies. Therefore, all my solutions look a bit alike. Now let's take a look how these Azure policies work, because the first time you get started, they can be quite complicated. But in the simplest term, first we have to define a policy. So either we can use a Microsoft built-in one, or we can write one ourselves. And then we have to tell the policy what it should do. For example, we can only allow the creation of resources in a specific location. For example, in West Europe. This makes sense if this is a requirement, especially a legal requirement. If I'm a company that has to have all the resources in Europe for example, data protection, then this might make sense. Another policy could be that I only want to allow the creation of specific SKUs of VMs. This also might make sense if I buy reservations from Microsoft, so I get my VMs for cheaper. Then I want to have the same VMs all over my company, so I can apply these reservations to all of them. Now let's take a look at how this definition looks in Azure. Here I have the policy with the name allowed locations. It's a Microsoft built-in policy. This means it's already provided by Microsoft. I can just pick it and apply it, but I can also copy it and change it if I need to. The first time you see a policy, it's probably quite complicated what's going on, and the rules of the policies are still for me sometimes hard to understand. But now let's take a look at what rules we have here. So that's in this section, the policy rule. Let's zoom in a little bit, and I don't want to go too much into detail, but what we can see here, we have a field with the name location, and then we check its value. In this case, we make sure that the value not equals to global, and also that the type not equals to Azure Active Directory, B2C directories. If the policy rule applies, then we have an effect on what should happen. That's down here. So let's zoom in again. And in this case, the effect is deny. This means if the policy rule applies, then the policy will deny the creation or the update of the resource you try to change or create. The other effects we have are allow. This is the opposite of deny. And we also have audit. Audit is great if you want to get started because it still allows you to create the resources, but you will get an overview of the compliance and you will see what is going on in your tenant. This is great to get started with policies without breaking everything for the developers. Once you're confident that you fulfill or apply to the policy, then you can change it from audit to either apply or deny, depending on what you want to achieve with it. These policies can be assigned almost everywhere, so you can assign them on the entire tenant, but also on management groups, subscriptions, or resource groups. And also inside these assignments, you can have exclusions. For example, you can assign it to a management group, but exclude certain subscriptions. This often makes sense because you want to have the strictest rules on your production environment, but less strict rules on your development subscriptions, because your developers should be able to try out things. But in production, you want to as secure as possible. Then maybe the biggest advantage of Azure policies is that once you have assigned a policy to a scope, then the checks are done automatically. Microsoft says they are done within 24 hours, but later I'm going to show you how you can force them. But this means that the policy automatically checks the status of your resources, and then you get an overview of what is going on inside your tenant. I think Azure policies can be quite complicated in the beginning, at least for me they were. But let's look at a couple use cases, and then I hope it makes more sense when and how to use them. So the first use case would be you want to audit your existing resources. So you can deploy a policy, set it to audit, and then you get a report of what is going on. For example, if you go back to the policy with the location, you can deploy the policy with the location should be West Europe, and then you get a report of which resources are not in West Europe. Then the next use case would be to prevent future non-compliance of resources. This means you can set the policy to only allow the deployment in West Europe, if we stay with our example. And then if developers try to create resources that are not in West Europe, they will get an error message and they won't be able to kind of break this rule. This is great if you introduce new security or compliance guidelines. This means you can remediate the ones you have and try to be compliant, but you also prevent of the creation of further resources. Therefore, you will stay compliant once you reach the state. This also leads to another great feature, that's the that it can automate the remediation of non-compliant resources. This does not work for all policies, but where I've seen it most commonly is if you have a policy that enforces to have certain tags on your resources. This could be, for example, who is the owner, what is the cost center, or what project does this resource belong to. If a resource doesn't have these tags, then the remediation task can automatically apply this tag. Therefore, you will be compliant without the developers having to do anything. And the last advantage is that with the Azure policies, you get a centralized dashboard. This means you can see exactly how many or what percentage of my resources are compliant, and you can also see which resources are not compliant, and you can also click on them so you get all the information. If you look here at an Azure policy, I just picked a random one and we don't have to go too much into details, but here in the middle, we can see I get information of the compliance state, and further down, I can see what resources are compliant and which ones are not, and I can just click on them and get all the information. For today, I want to show you two different examples how we can apply these Azure policies with our AKS cluster. First, I want to show you how we can manage the resources inside our cluster. This could be, for example, that I want to run my pods as a non-root user or as a non-privileged user. Or it could also be that all my pods have to have resource limits and request limits. If they don't follow these rules, then the pods can't be created. All of this can be done with the Azure Policy add-on. And I'm going to show you how to install this on an AKS cluster. Then the second demo I want to do is we are going to create an Azure policy to manage the configuration of our AKS cluster. In the demo, we're going to create a policy that requires our AKS cluster to have the image cleaner enabled. And once the policy is deployed, I'm going to show you the status and how to remediate it. Now let's switch over to the terminal and let's get started creating our AKS cluster. Installing the add-on is very simple and just a simple command. We use the AKS enable add-ons command. We provide the name of our AKS cluster, the name of the resource group, and with the add-ons flag, we provide the name, and that's Azure Policy in our case. So I'm going to deploy this. It's going to take a couple minutes again, and once this is finished, we're going to apply our first Azure Policy. The Azure Policy add-on has been installed successfully, and what this installation does is it creates a couple pods. First, there are, I think, 2 pods for Azure Policy itself, but then there are also a couple pods of Gatekeeper, and Gatekeeper is an open source tool that helps us to apply our policies. Just to double check that everything worked as expected, let's check if everything has been installed. So we use the AKS show command, then we provide the name of our cluster, then again the resource group name, and we query the add-on profile Azure Policy. There you can see everything seems in order and we don't get any error messages. So with this in place, we can now go to Azure Policy in the Azure portal and apply our first policy to our AKS cluster. Here in the Azure portal, we can search on top for policy. Then we open the policy tab, and there we can see the entire menu for all the policies. For example, if we go down here on definitions, we can see all the built-in policies Microsoft provides. If we scroll down here, you can see it's a very long list. But we can also filter by categories. So there we can filter for Kubernetes, and we select Kubernetes in this case. Kubernetes service would be to manage our cluster, and if we select Kubernetes only, then it's for inside the cluster. This gives us less, but still quite the list that's already built in by Microsoft. So we can just pick and use them, and we don't have to change anything. But if you want to, we can also copy them and change them, or just take them as the foundation for our own policies. Or I just start at 0 and write our full own policy. For this demo, I want to apply a policy that does not allow us to run privileged containers. This is due to security reasons. We want to run with as little permissions as possible, and Microsoft already has a built-in one for this. So the name is Kubernetes cluster should not allow privileged containers. If you click on this one, then you can see here the definition, which is for this demo not that important. But what is important is how do we manage to get this applied to our cluster now. To do this, we have on the top here the Assign Policy button. Then we can provide the scope. In this case, it is my subscription, but it can also provide a management group or even only a resource group. Then in the exclusions, you can exclude resources, for example, a specific resource group inside the subscription or a subscription inside a management group. Then we have to provide an assignment name. And here it makes sense to write something that you know what it is, because it only takes the name of the policy. And if you apply a specific policy several times, then it gets confusing. For now, that's fine. And a description, we also don't need one. but it helps you to figure out what this policy does in the future. Then with the parameter, you can see here is the deny effect. This means if I try to create a pod that does not follow this policy, the creation will be denied. Alternatively, we can have audit, so we just get a log of what is happening, or we can also disable the policy. But for now, we just leave it as denied. Then we can also exclude certain images. For example, if we have one image that must run in a privileged mode, then we can exclude it there, and so we are still able to run it. We can also exclude namespaces, but this is not available here in this view. This is only available to see once we have assigned the policy for whatever reason. Then the next tab, we have the remediation task. I'm not sure if this works with this policy, but in case it would work, you can create a remediation task, and then this remediation task makes sure that your resources follow the policy. And lastly, we can just create it. So what we now did is we took a policy and assigned it to our subscription. This means it's now on the subscription, and now I can test it. So I'm going to connect to my AKS cluster. I create a pod that does not follow this policy, and then I should see an error message. To do this, let's switch back to the terminal and let's get started with figuring out if it works or not. Back in the terminal, first let's download the kubeconfig file. So it's just AC AKS get credentials, then the name of the resource group and the AKS cluster, and this downloads the kubeconfig, and now we can access our AKS cluster. First, I always like to create a new namespace because it makes it easier to clean up, and I can also see exactly what I did. So let's create a namespace called privileged. Then we are going to try to deploy a pod that's running in privileged mode. Before we do this, let's take a look at the configuration of this pod. It's as simple as it can get. So I'm using the busybox image, and the important part is down here, the security context, and the privileged is set to true. This means this pod is running in the privileged mode. If we switch back to the terminal, let's try to apply this, but I've seen that I'm in the wrong folder. So let's switch this quickly. Now let's apply the file I just showed you. And here you can see it says forbidden. We also can see the error message comes from Gatekeeper. That's, as I said before, a tool that helps you to apply our policies. And if you look further down, we can see here, privileged container is not allowed. So this already gives us an indication what the problem is. And it also tells us where the problem is inside our configuration. So if here security context, privileged equals to true. But to test that we can still run pods, especially that are non-privileged, I have created a second configuration that's basically the same, except the security context is removed. If you don't set the security context explicitly to privileged, it's running in an unprivileged mode. This means we should be able to deploy this pod. So let's switch back to the terminal, clean this up, and let's deploy this non-privileged pod. This time it worked. We didn't get any error message, and everything seems to be fine. To make sure it's running, let's do a kubectl get pod with the namespace privileged. Here you can see the pod is running 16 seconds ago. So everything works. We applied our policy and we prevent privileged containers or pods to be created. Therefore, we can ensure that we have only non-privileged pods running. And this also follows our security guidance. and just make sure that we have security and compliance overall. What I haven't mentioned is I've applied this to my subscription. So if I create a new cluster and have the Azure Policy add-on installed on this cluster, then the policy applies automatically on this cluster as well. I could also create a policy that enforces the add-on to be installed in the clusters, and therefore I make sure all my clusters have the add-on installed, and therefore all policies get applied to all the AKS or Kubernetes resources. I also only have to apply all of this once, because in the Azure Policy I can just set the scope and then I don't have to apply it again. Also, another thing, if I already have a pod running in a privileged mode, it will continue to run. But if the pod fails and tries to restart, it won't be able to restart. So if you apply a policy like this, keep this in mind, or set the policy to audit and just monitor what is going on inside your cluster. The last thing I want to show you is how to check the logs of the Azure Policy pod and the Gatekeeper pod, just in case something doesn't work as expected, so you can take a look. First, let's take a look at all the pods in the kube system namespace. And there are quite a lot, but if you scroll up a bit, we should find an Azure Policy pod. It's down here. There are 2 pods. So if we copy the name of this one and we do a kubectl logs with the name of the pod, then we can see all the logs of this pod. In this case, it's just a big wall of text. And I'm also not sure if the logs are too useful, but I think it's important that you know that they are there and you could use a better tool to go through the logs if you have to. The second resource or pod that's involved in all of this is the Gatekeeper pods. So they are in the Gatekeeper system. And if you query them, we can see we have 3 pods. One is the audit pod and then 2 controller. If you copy the name of one of the controllers and do a kubectl logs again, then we can see here the logs. It's again a big wall of text, but I think these logs are a bit more useful because we can see here denied admission, and we can see the policy why it was not allowed. And we can also see here that the security context is set to privileged equals true. That's exactly the problem we had before. So I think this is probably the most useful place to search for logs. But for me, it's just important that you have heard that these logs exist. Okay, this was the first part of my demo. So we created a policy and applied it to the resources inside our cluster. Next, I want to assign a policy that's applying to the cluster on the outside or the cluster itself. This means we want to make sure that our cluster is configured according to our guidelines. To do this, let's switch back to the Azure portal, and then we're going to apply again a built-in policy. Back in the Azure portal, in the Azure Policy menu, now we're going to search for another policy, and that's the Azure Kubernetes Service clusters should enable image cleaner. That's again a Microsoft built-in one. And if you click on this, we can see the configuration. Again, for this demo, it's not too important. The probably most interesting part is here the allowed values that we can only see audit or disabled. So there's no enforcing of this. Now let's assign this policy again to the subscription, and I'll leave everything as it is for now. Then the effect is only audit. This means I will only get a report. I don't want to create a remediation task. And I also don't want to have a non-compliance message. But this is very useful for the developers. So if they have a policy and they try to deploy a resource that is breaking this policy, then it will get an error message. And as a developer, you don't really know or think about these policies, so you just don't know why it didn't work. And with this non-compliance message, you can guide your developers, for example, to a page in your wiki or just an explanation why it didn't work. For now, we just leave it as it is, and we create this assignment. So it has been created. Now let's go back here. And then if we go on the assignments, we can see all the assignments we made on the subscription. Here you can see the 2 we assigned before. If we click now on the image cleaner policy, then we have here on the top view compliance. If we click on this one, we can see the compliance of our resources inside the subscription. So if we scroll down a bit, it already picked up the AKS cluster. But if you apply this the first time, it might take a while until the first evaluation runs. Microsoft says that it might take up to 24 hours until the policy is evaluated. If you don't want to wait for so long, there's a simple command so you can trigger the scan. So let's take a quick look in the terminal and I'll show you the command to execute the scan. Here in the terminal, the command you have to execute is AC policy state trigger scan, and then you provide the name of the resource group. Once you execute the command, all the policies that apply to the resource group will be evaluated, but it also might take quite a long time. Even if only the one policy I have, it takes between 10 and 15 minutes. I also forgot to mention that all the commands you've seen today are on my GitHub, and the link will be in the description below. Since the policy already has been evaluated, let's switch back to the Azure portal and try to fix it now. So you can see it is non-compliant, and the resource that's not compliant is named AKS policy. That's the AKS cluster we have created before. If we click on this cluster, we can see more information about it. We can see what policy is not compliant. And then we can click on View Resource. In this case, we want to have the image cleaner enabled. And this is in the security configuration, I think. And yeah, it is here, the image cleaner. And what this image cleaner does is it checks all the worker nodes for stale images. This means images you're not using anymore, and the image cleaner deletes them. So no attacker can run old, outdated images. Now we're going to apply this. We don't have to configure anything. We can just leave it as it is. Once this is saved, this is going to take a couple minutes. Then I'm going to trigger the scan of the policy by hand. And also after the scan is finished, then our policy should say that we are 100% compliant. The image cleaner has been enabled. Now we can switch to the terminal and trigger the scan of the policies again. Here in the terminal, we use, as I said before, AC policy state trigger scan, and we provide the name of the resource group in which our AKS cluster is located. This will take around 10 to 15 minutes, and once it's finished, I will go back to the Azure policy, and I expect that we are fully compliant with the policy. So let's wait until it's finished, and then we will see. It took quite some time, but the scan is finished, and now we can switch back to the Azure portal, and there we should see that we are now compliant with our Azure policy. Back in the Azure portal, let's search again for policy. There we can already see an overview of all our policies, or we can also go to assignments and we can see it there too. Now we select the image cleaner policy. Then on top, we click on View Compliance. And here we can see that we are 100% compliant with this policy. If we scroll further down, we can see here that our AKS policy cluster is now compliant, and we adhere to all the rules this policy sets. This is everything I wanted to show you today. Azure Policy can be quite complicated when you begin with it, but don't be intimidated because I think it's a great tool to apply rules and governance all over your resources in your entire tenant. My recommendation would be to start small, start with one policy, also set this policy in the audit mode so you can see what is going on without breaking anything. And if you're confident, then set it into the deny or allow mode. And then go from there. Add more policies, add more complicated policies, and just go on and on until you have implemented all the policies you want to use. I hope this video was interesting for you. Let me know in the comments. If you didn't like it, also let me know in the comments. And I will see you next week with a new video.